Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our continuing study of the United States and the Cold War. In this lecture, we'll turn to our discussion of the origins of the Cold War. Students sometimes ask how it came to be that two nations who were allies during World War II so quickly came to be rivals and enemies in the aftermath of the war. And while it's certainly legitimate to wonder about this, I think by the end of this lecture, it'll be demonstrated that such students are asking the wrong question. How was it that two longtime rivals ever came to be allies during the war in the first place? What we'll learn is that the origins of the Cold War, this rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union, can be found not in World War II, but in long-standing differences, in some cases dating back centuries. Those who are looking for the origins of the Cold War during World War II might be surprised at this quote from the famous French traveler and political scientist, social commentarist Alexis de Tocqueville, who wrote in his classic work, Democracy in America, "There are now two great nations in the world, which, starting from different points, seem to be advancing toward the same goal, the Russians and the Anglo-Americans. Each seems called by some secret design of Providence one day to hold in its hands the destinies of half the world." This was written in 1835, well over a century before the beginning of what we call the Cold War. Tocqueville seemed prescient in his prediction that at some point these two nations would each hold in their hands half the world. But his prediction was perhaps a century too soon. Tocqueville's quote indicates, though, that the origins of the Cold War go back much, much farther than World War II itself. There are those who trace this rivalry in some ways to the very origins of the globe itself. This is a continental rivalry. This is a rivalry between East and West that is inevitable simply by the nature of geography itself and the nature of the planet. Scholars who embrace this world system view of things point out that the nature of East and West are simply different in their origins. They are rooted in different civilizations. The East more rooted in Asiatic influences, the West more in European. They also point to the geographical and thus economic differences in these two regions. The North Atlantic and the United States are more fundamentally maritime powers, looking outwardly upon the world, while the Asian powers and Russia are more land-based powers with large land-based armies and centralized control, often looking more inward. Moving forward in time, there are many scholars who point to the rivalry between the United Kingdom and Russia over the centuries, primarily for control of the seas, as Russia, again a land-based power, perpetually sought access to the seas, which tended to be controlled by the United Kingdom and its vast imperial empire spreading across the world. This led at times to conflict between Britain and Russia in places like the Middle East, India, Afghanistan, and the Far East in Asia and the coastal waters. While not wedded to these causes, the United States typically sided with Great Britain in this conflict, and therefore found itself aligned against Russia, although usually in a relatively mild way, in its efforts to seek alliance with Great Britain. In that vein, there are those who, like Tocqueville, seem to suggest that conflict between these two continent-sized powers, each with huge reserves of manpower and natural resources, was simply inevitable. These two nations were destined to be the great rivals on the planet. The more immediate origins of the direct rivalry between the United States and Russia can be found in the late 19th century and early 20th century, when the United States and Russia began to clash, at first over the development of Manchuria. The Russians sought to close off and colonize parts of East Asia, including China, while the Americans demanded open competition and the famous open door, which was one of its major policy statements of the late 19th and early 20th century. Teddy Roosevelt helped to broker a peace between Japan and Russia at the end of the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And his comments suggest that he was no great fan of the Russians in this conflict. No human beings, black, yellow, or white, could be quite as untruthful, as insincere, as arrogant, in short, as untrustworthy in every way as the Russians, Roosevelt wrote in 1905. In 1917, during World War I, after a coup of the revolutionary democratic government by the Bolsheviks in Russia, the rivalry gained an intensely ideological component. The Bolsheviks espoused a communist, anti-capitalist ideology. This was especially threatening to the United States, as it offered benefit to the poor masses of workers, which I'll mention in just a moment. The United States had millions of poor immigrant workers who might have been attracted to communism, and indeed, many were. As Karl Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, the theory of the communists may be summed up in a single sentence: abolition of private property. Well, this may have sounded pretty good to those who didn't possess much property themselves, which defined the masses of millions of immigrant workers who were flooding into the United States in the late 19th and early 20th century. The Bolsheviks also championed a world revolution. Communism, in its ideal form, would incorporate the entire world. Communists, almost like some religions, advocated spreading their belief system and winning converts around the world. This, too, was seen as threatening in the United States, as there became fear of communists in our midst, working secretly to overthrow capitalism and democracy. This phenomenon points us toward the Red Scare in the wake of World War I, which I'll discuss in a moment. Vladimir Lenin expressed this view of the global expansion of communism well in 1920 when he said, "We knew in October 1917 that our victory would be a lasting victory only when our undertaking should conquer the world." Finally, the American system of government is federal. That is, power distributed widely to state and local governments while overseen from above by the federal government. The Soviet system is strictly state-controlled. In fact, tightly and brutally controlled. There is a long record of brutality in Russia, including intense anti-Semitic attacks in the late 19th century and a consistent record of imprisonment and even execution of dissenters. The United States is reluctant to become close with such nations. Not only were there these ideological differences between the Bolsheviks and the Americans, but in fact, the leaders of the new Bolshevik government undertook a number of actions that drove them increasingly away from the United States. Upon taking power, the Bolsheviks repudiated foreign debt, including American debt, and they confiscated American-owned property in Russia and distributed it among the citizens. The Western Allies also never forgot that the new Soviet government negotiated a separate peace with Germany at the end of World War I in 1918, leaving the remaining Western Allies to fight the Central Powers alone. And so again, we might wonder, not so much how these two allies fell into differences in the aftermath of World War II, but how did they ever become allies in the first place? In the next lecture, I'll continue this discussion of the background of the rivalry between the United States and the Soviets in the decades before World War II.